What if the greatest kingdom in Nusantara began collapsing at the height of its power? Not when it was weak, not when it was poor, not after defeat, but when the world seemed to acknowledge its greatness without hesitation or doubt. Imagine standing at the heart of Majapahit during its golden age. Markets overflow with merchants from distant lands carrying precious and exotic goods. Ships crowd the harbors, bringing spices, gold, and wealth from across seas. The name of Majapahit echoes across oceans and commands respect from rulers. Its influence stretches beyond horizons visible to the human eye. From the outside, everything appears perfect, magnificent, and impossible to defeat. Yet history has a strange habit that many powerful leaders often ignore. When people believe they cannot lose, decline often begins in silence, like a shadow slowly growing behind the bright light of victory. At that time, Majapahit symbolized power, prosperity, and unity throughout Nusantara, a kingdom that seemed capable of surviving every challenge history could offer. Yet not every threat arrives with swords, fleets, or invading armies. Some dangers are far more destructive because they remain invisible. Threats that grow quietly within the very heart of a kingdom. Threats that require no great war to destroy an empire from within. At the time, almost no one truly recognized the danger approaching, because success often blinds people to cracks forming beneath their feet. Small cracks that can one day topple even the grandest structures. And Majapahit stood directly above such cracks, growing wider each day. An extraordinary story of glory was about to become an unexpected tragedy. And it all began when one remarkable man changed Nusantara's destiny forever. At the center of that golden age stood a man named Gajah Mada. His name would become a symbol of ambition throughout Nusantara's history. Years earlier, he had sworn an oath many considered impossible to fulfill. He vowed to reject luxury until Nusantara had been fully united. Many doubted him and openly mocked the boldness of that promise. Yet slowly, what seemed impossible began turning into reality. One territory after another came under the growing influence of Majapahit. Distant islands learned to recognize Majapahit as a dominant regional power. Fleets crossed vast seas, extending the kingdom's reach year after year. Upon the throne sat Hayam Wuruk, ruler of Majapahit's golden age. Together, Hayam Wuruk and Gajah Mada formed an extraordinary partnership. They complemented each other like two halves of a single vision. Hayam Wuruk provided legitimacy and royal authority respected throughout the kingdom. Gajah Mada contributed strategy, determination, and unmatched political skill. Together, they built a network of influence spanning countless islands and seas. Envoys arrived from distant regions bearing tribute and declarations of loyalty. Wealth flowed toward the capital from every corner of the realm. To many people, Majapahit appeared to be the center of their world. Its prosperity grew, and its influence became increasingly difficult to challenge. Many rulers preferred submission rather than risking conflict against such power. From the outside, Majapahit seemed to have reached its highest peak. A peak previous generations could only dream of achieving. Yet the higher a kingdom rises, the heavier its burdens become. And those burdens were beginning to create problems no one could easily see. The larger the empire became, the harder it was to keep united. Messages traveled across seas, mountains, and forests before reaching the capital. Every region possessed interests that did not always align with the center. Governing a vast empire proved far more difficult than conquering one. Yet the greatest problems did not come from distant territories. They grew quietly among those closest to the seat of power. Behind palace walls, whispers slowly replaced openness and trust. Smiles remained, but many hearts were filled with suspicion. The nobles understood a reality that could not be avoided forever. One day, this immense power would have to be inherited. And whenever the inheritance is enormous, competition grows even stronger. Ambition slowly emerged behind faces that appeared completely loyal. Some began calculating influence, opportunities, and future positions. Others quietly built alliances designed to secure their own futures. No swords were drawn, but the struggle had already begun. A struggle fought through conversations, agreements, and secret meetings. From the outside, Majapahit still appeared as solid as a mountain. Yet hidden cracks had begun forming deep within its foundation. Those cracks seemed small and insignificant at first glance. But history often shows that great collapses begin with tiny fractures. Meanwhile, one important figure faced an enemy he could never defeat. Not a foreign kingdom, not rebels, and not invading fleets. His enemy was time itself, moving forward without mercy or pause. And time was slowly catching up with the legendary Gajah Mada. Gajah Mada remained respected, but he was no longer a young man. Time was slowly taking what no enemy had ever managed to seize. No person can negotiate with age as it continues moving forward. No victory can stop the relentless passage of time. Many people began asking a question rarely spoken aloud. What would happen after Gajah Mada was no longer there to lead? The question seemed simple, yet its answer disturbed many people. Much of Majapahit's greatness had been shaped by his leadership. Many territories submitted because they respected and feared his name. If he disappeared, the balance might disappear with him. That concern grew like a small flame hidden from view. From a distance, the flame seemed weak and harmless. Yet small flames often become fires that consume everything. Hayam Wuruk still maintained stability and authority throughout the kingdom. His charisma united groups with very different interests and ambitions. As long as the king lived, many conflicts remained hidden. Few dared challenge the authority of the royal center. But hidden conflicts do not mean conflicts have disappeared. They simply wait for the right moment to emerge, waiting for a time when obstacles no longer stand in their way. And sooner or later, that opportunity inevitably arrives. The kingdom still shone brightly, but signs of change appeared. The storm had not arrived yet, but its shadow was visible. Majapahit was approaching a moment that would change its destiny forever. Then the day everyone feared finally arrived for Majapahit. Gajah Mada, architect of its greatness, was no longer there. His departure left behind a void few could hope to fill. A great empire had suddenly lost one of its strongest pillars. At first, little seemed to change on the surface. Markets remained crowded and ships still filled the busy harbors. Yet beneath the routine, the balance was beginning to shift. The figure who had managed competing interests was now gone. And when the guardian disappears, ambition often moves more freely. Nobles began noticing opportunities that once seemed out of reach. Small factions quietly built influence and strengthened their own networks. Rivalries remained hidden, but they were becoming increasingly noticeable. Hayam Wuruk still preserved stability through his respected authority. Yet even the greatest king cannot live forever, and that reality worried many people more with each passing year. Questions about succession became more common than ever before. Who would control an empire of such immense scale? Who possessed the right power and support to rule? No answer seemed capable of satisfying every competing interest. And when answers remain unclear, conflict often finds its own path. To outsiders, Majapahit still looked like an unstoppable giant. But within the palace, seeds of division were taking root. Seeds that would eventually grow into something far more dangerous. Something that wealth and past glory could no longer solve. Time moved forward and brought Majapahit to its greatest test. The death of Hayam Wuruk became a turning point in history. With him vanished the figure who had united many competing interests. Grief spread across the palace, the capital, and distant territories. Yet behind the mourning, one question dominated every important conversation. Who would succeed the ruler of Majapahit's golden age? An empty throne often attracts ambitions long hidden from sight. And Majapahit contained many powerful figures with competing goals. Some believed they possessed a legitimate claim to rule. Others believed their influence alone justified leadership. Gradually, relationships that once seemed harmonious began to strain. Rivalries were no longer fully concealed behind smiles and ceremony. Factions formed around family ties, political interests, and personal ambitions. Each group worked to gather as much support as possible. Loyalty became one of the most valuable commodities in the kingdom. Old friends could become enemies because of power and succession. Even relatives could find themselves standing on opposite sides. No kingdom is completely immune to dangers like these. To the outside world, Majapahit still looked strong and stable. Yet internally, the foundations of its greatness faced growing pressure. That pressure increased as rival factions expanded their influence. No one knew exactly when the conflict would erupt openly, but many sensed that the era of calm was ending. And when the storm arrived, Majapahit would face its most dangerous enemy. The enemy that finally arrived was not a foreign fleet from distant seas, nor was it a powerful kingdom seeking Majapahit's wealth and territories. The enemy emerged from within, from people who knew the kingdom intimately. They understood Majapahit's strengths and every weakness hidden beneath its glory. Tensions that had long remained hidden began turning into open conflict. Words that once solved problems were no longer enough. Clashing ambitions created deep divisions among the kingdom's noble families. Each faction believed it possessed the strongest claim and justification. And when no one is willing to yield, division becomes inevitable. Gradually, the once united kingdom began breaking into rival camps. Family bonds were no longer strong enough to suppress political rivalry. Old friendships cracked beneath the pressure of ambition and distrust. Most tragic of all, this conflict was not against strangers. They faced fellow nobles, fellow citizens, and even their own relatives. There is no war more painful than a war among brothers. Every victory comes at the cost of something deeply personal. Every battle leaves wounds far deeper than those caused by enemies. Majapahit remained wealthy, vast, and rich in resources. Yet even immense power struggles to survive when divided from within. Little by little, the kingdom's energy was consumed by internal conflict. Strength once used to build was now spent weakening one another. The outside world began noticing signs that something was changing. The giant that once seemed invincible was revealing its vulnerability. And from this moment emerges the most surprising question in the story. Then comes a question rarely asked in stories about Majapahit's greatness. What if its peak of glory was also the beginning of its decline? The idea sounds strange, yet it becomes convincing upon closer examination. Because many great problems emerge not during failure, but during success. When a kingdom is small, its goals are usually simple and clear. Survive, expand, and defend against threats from the outside world. But everything changes once those goals have largely been achieved. Vast territories were already under Majapahit's influence and control. External enemies became fewer while prosperity continued to increase. And that was precisely when new problems began to appear. People were no longer struggling merely to survive as before. They began competing for power, inheritance, prestige, and personal advantage. Success itself created something few people had anticipated, a tremendous reward that also became a tremendous burden. The larger the empire, the greater the temptation to control it. Wealth attracts ambition just as light attracts insects in darkness. Power attracts rivalry even among those who were once allies. And that rivalry continued growing stronger with every passing year. Ironically, Majapahit's greatest achievements created unforeseen dangers. Prosperity produced conditions where internal conflicts could flourish. It was as though success contained the seeds of failure all along. Tiny seeds that quietly grew during years of stability and wealth. And once fully grown, they became impossible for anyone to stop. Perhaps that is the most tragic irony in Majapahit's entire story. The longer we study it, the clearer a pattern begins to emerge. Many great empires collapse not because of weakness, but because of success. They rise so high that maintaining their position becomes increasingly difficult. Majapahit appears to have faced the same paradox during its golden age. The kingdom became extraordinarily large, perhaps larger than many could manage. Too many interests, too many ambitions, too many centers of influence. All moved together when external threats were still very real. But when those threats faded, their paths began diverging. Unity gradually transformed into competition that drained the kingdom's strength. Resources were spent on conflicts that should never have existed. Energy once used to build was now used to weaken one another. And that is one of the most dangerous traps facing powerful states. They often focus on threats beyond their borders. Meanwhile, the greatest danger grows within the walls of power itself. It arrives without enemy banners, warships, or siege engines. It comes as greed, ambition, and rivalry growing quietly over time, Difficult to defeat because it originates from former allies and friends. Difficult to stop because every side believes it is right. If Gajah Mada had lived longer, perhaps events might have unfolded differently. If Hayam Wuruk had ruled longer, perhaps history would have changed. But history does not recognize if, nor does it wait for anyone. What remains are lessons from a kingdom that lost its balance. Lessons showing that great strength often carries great risk. And those lessons lead us to the final and unsettling conclusion. In the end, Majapahit's story leaves us with a deeper question. Did the kingdom decline because of weakness or because of success itself? The closer we examine its history, the more surprising the answer becomes. Majapahit was not destroyed by a stronger foreign power. No invading empire suddenly appeared and erased its greatness overnight. No single catastrophe instantly shattered the foundations of its rule. Instead, extraordinary success created challenges that became increasingly difficult to manage. Challenges that quietly grew beneath prosperity, victory, and glory. It was as if their greatest triumph carried a hidden cost. A cost that would not be paid immediately, but years later. And when the bill finally arrived, no one could avoid it. That is the twist that makes Majapahit's story both tragic and timeless. The peak of glory may not be the end of a journey. Sometimes it marks the beginning of the most dangerous challenge. Because reaching the summit is easier than remaining there. And very few empires throughout history have managed to do so. Today, most of Majapahit's magnificent palaces survive only in memory. Many of its officials' names have faded into the passage of time. Yet the lessons of Majapahit remain alive and relevant even now, because human nature has changed far less than we often believe. Ambition, power, success, and rivalry still shape the modern world. That is why Majapahit's story feels closer to us than expected. Perhaps the greatest enemy is not the one beyond the borders. Perhaps the greatest enemy has always grown quietly from within.